Hello and welcome to Voices of BlueScope, the podcast where we go behind the scenes at BlueScope to meet the people who create strength every day. I'm your host, Martin Feld. Thank you for joining us. In this episode, we're featuring a special panel discussion that was streamed live to employees at BlueScope in line with NAIDOC Week, and which explored the work of and our collaboration with NPY Women's Council, specifically through secondments with Jawun. Furthermore, it included conversation about how anyone can learn more about Indigenous people across Australia and become a First Nations ally. First and foremost, however, I wish to make a proper acknowledgement. BlueScope acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land on which we work, live and operate. We recognise our First Nations peoples who have inhabited Australia for millennia, their enduring connection to country, sky and waterways, and their rich and vital cultures. We acknowledge the many different nations across this ancient continent, from rural and remote communities to our cities and suburban streets. We honour and pay respect to ancestors, elders and their descendants as the custodians of this country. It is through the ancestral knowledges and stories of local peoples that we can more fully know and understand country and the unique ways in which country connects us all. In recording this podcast introduction, I'm coming to you from Dharawal country in the city of Wollongong on the east coast of Australia. Looking through my window now, I can see Gira, otherwise known as Mount Kira, which is a site of significant cultural heritage for the Wadi Wadi people and a prominent feature of the Illawarra escarpment. I grew up in this region and am grateful for it, and I hope that as you listen to this episode, you'll also consider the history, cultures, and beauty of the area where you live. Returning to context for the recorded panel discussion, NPY Women's Council is a leader in the provision of human services in the NPY region. Proudly Anangu-led, NPY Women's Council is governed and directed by Aboriginal women across 26 desert communities in the cross-border regions of Western Australia, South Australia and the Northern Territory, an area covering 350,000 square kilometres. NPY Women's Council partners with Jawun, which is a not-for-profit organisation that places skilled people from various government agencies and companies, such as BlueScope, into Indigenous organisations. These participants bring their varied knowledge and expertise to support Indigenous leaders in achieving their own goals. Our four panellists included two Jawun secondment alumni from BlueScope, Aneta Pyzel, Marketing Communications Manager, and Yasmine Gardner, Senior Legal Counsel, along with two key NPY representatives, Liza Balmer, CEO, and Lynette Ross, Deputy CEO, who is from Alice Springs and of Western and Central Arrernte and Kaitieta lineage. Altogether, they shared their respective experiences and views on working with Indigenous communities and what resources are available to learn more about First Nations across Australia. You'll also hear a dedicated Q&A at the end of the recording, which was facilitated by Jessica Thompson, Organisational Capability Advisor at BlueScope, and who was responsible for organising the online event. Let's cross to the panel discussion now.
Aneta Pyzel. I'm dialing in today from the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation here in New South Wales. And I've actually done my Jawun secondment almost 3 years ago with the incredible NPY Women's Council, but only just recently in May I had the opportunity to meet Liza and Lynette in person in the region.
My name is Liza Balmer. I'm the CEO at, I'll say it in full for you, the Ngandara Pindara Yangundera Women's Council. I've been here for almost half my life, I think, and I came initially to start up the child nutrition program, so my background's in public health.
I'm Lynette Ross. I'm the Deputy CEO for the NPY Women's Council, and I'm very relatively new. I think I'm coming into my 4th month with the Women's Council. Prior to here, I worked for Voyages Indigenous Tourism Australia out at Yalara for 3 years as a General Manager for the Indigenous Engagement Team. Prior to that, I was a public servant for 22 years. So this is my first NGO that I've worked for, which is surprising coming from Alice Springs, being an Aboriginal woman, and I'm really, really enjoying it. And it's same but different, but it's probably a little bit more rewarding than being a public servant.
My name's Yasmine Gardner. I'm a senior legal counsel in the ASP business at BlueScope. I'm based in Melbourne, so coming to you from Wurundjeri land. And I've been at BlueScope for 10 years, just coming up to 10 years now. I started off in the corporate head office in the legal team there, and have sort of had lots of different hats during my time at BlueScope, but currently working predominantly for the ASM and credit functions in ASP. And I had the pleasure of going on secondment and working with Liza at NPY Women's Council last year, so November, December last year, which was a great experience, and we'll get into that shortly.
Thanks to each of you for giving that background and letting us know who you are and why you're here. So to kick off the discussion, following that introduction, I'd like to dig into the actual history and aims of the NPY Women's Council and how it connects to BlueScope and Jawun and secondment partnership. Maybe starting with you, Liza, as CEO of the NPY Women's Council, can you give us some context for what the council does, how it works with and helps First Nations communities, and what brings us to today?
Sure. So the Women's Council was formed in 1980, in December 1980. And at the time, Anil, as we refer to Aboriginal people in this region, were in negotiation with the South Australian government around land rights and freehold land for what we now know as the APY lands of South Australia. It's the northwest of South Australia. And the South Australian government was willing to give back the land, but they were determined to maintain rights to mining on the lands. And of course, were not very happy about that. And the men had really gathered themselves together. They'd formed the Pindera Council and employed male lawyers, male anthropologists, and they were gearing up to, I guess, go into battle with the South Australian government to ensure that they retained full land rights and not just partial land rights. And when the women tried to participate or tried to get involved in the discussions, they were actively told to be quiet, to go away, that this was men's business, not women's business. And of course, the women in our region wouldn't settle for that. They said, not on your life, brothers. And and one of our, I guess we call her our founding member, Mundadera Wilson, she invited all of her friends and families from the Ngandara, Pindera, Yankunytjatjara region. So it's the cross-border region of South Australia, Northern Territory, Western Australia. And she called them all to come to a meeting in a place called Kampi. And it was at that meeting that the women decided to form their own council so they could have, and interestingly, in today's context, so they could have their own voice. And so they got together, they formed a council. Initially, it was really just focusing on lobbying and advocacy around particular issues. So they were quite a force in the early days in leading transformation, particularly around alcohol reform, petrol sniffing, and then going on later on in the years to tackling things like domestic violence, child abuse and neglect, substance abuse, mental health, and so on. So from very humble beginnings of, I think, the first 13 years, there were maybe 5 staff. And then we went into service delivery in 1993. And today we are the largest provider of human services in the region. We have roughly 280 staff. And we provide services that support women and their families to our vision, I guess, is to live a better life with better life choices. And particularly with a focus on being able to live well in both worlds. So really, being masters of their own destiny, if you like. And we provide services from the cradle to the grave. So in a nutshell, our services are our child and family wellbeing services. We have a very large and extensive youth program, which is no surprise given that in our region, 50% of the population is under 24. We have aged and disability support programs. We have, sadly, a very big domestic and family violence program. We employ traditional healers. And, of course, we also have our wonderful social enterprise, Jumpy Desert Weavers. Now, I've done that in, I think, 4 minutes, maybe, which I would normally do in about an hour. So If you would like me to expand on that a bit, or if that's enough, let me know.
No, that's fantastic. And we could probably spend an hour on each of you. So that was very efficient. Thank you. I'm really interested, and thank you for that explanation. I'm really interested in what you said about both worlds there in this negotiation of different cultures or backgrounds. And more specifically in a First Nations context, can you maybe shed some light on the challenges that you have as an organisation in providing all of these really integral and important services in catering to many different First Nations backgrounds or countries? Is it a challenge to balance the needs and desires of different nations and community groups within the people that you serve?
Not so much within the people, because they see themselves as a collective.
Okay.
So that is not the challenge, but there are challenges around being lumped in as just simply Aboriginal. You know, that we know that the experience and circumstances and worldviews are very different among different First Nations populations around the country. And so it's often particularly being remote and not just being lumped in with this is what all Aboriginal people need or this is what all Aboriginal people want. And when I say remote, we're very remote, and we also cover 350,000 square kilometres, which is the same size as Germany. That in itself is a challenge. And then that raises all sorts of other challenges around arguing that our services cost a lot more to run than if you were to run the same service in Redfern. They're not apples for apples. You know, it's very different, and you need to run it different ways. Our education attainment levels are a lot lower here than they are in sort of East Coast city areas. So that's the challenge, I think, is identifying and recognising the particular challenges for people who live in remote communities.
Thank you for that further explanation. And at this point, I'd like to turn to Lynette in your role as Deputy CEO and as a person with Western and Central Arrernte and Katiete lineage. I want to know a little bit more about your identity and role within this area. Can you speak about your personal experience working with NPY Women's Council in Central Australia?
Yeah, sure. So I'm not from the NPY region, but obviously I am Aboriginal. So yep. Whilst I'm not from the region, there are still connections, whether that be family or we don't have Jukupa, we have Algira in our region, but often they do connect. So there is that connection, and I've found even working within the region and working with the women, once they place you and know who you are, there's that instant connection. So then it's a different relationship. So I've always, in all of my working life, I've always found it really easy. And whether I'm great at my job or not, I'm not sure. But I think for me, it's been more about that connection and knowing who I am and where I'm from. And that's the way Aboriginal people relate to each other. So that's often why people will ask who your mob are, where you're from. And, you know, instantly they'll connect and work out, okay, where you fit in. So coming into this job hasn't been easy. It's been really nice, because they can see where I'm from and who my mob are, and I don't know, there's that respect for each other.
And what have been some of the primary lessons that you've learnt in working with these communities in this region, or since joining NPY Women's Council?
Huge is just listening. Is actually listening to what people want, because you can listen but not hear what they're saying. And Aboriginal people, we're not direct. So if you want something, you're talking a roundabout way and never directly ask for what you want. You know, that's a generalisation. There are some people who are direct and are really upfront, but in these central regions, people are generally roundabout way. So you have to listen. You've got to listen deeply with all your senses and do it that way. So it's not straightforward.
Listening is a key point in providing care, I would say. And I'm glad you brought up that point, because in providing these services, there's some services that are more challenging to provide than others. I mean, first thing that comes to mind is that, for example, in health, there may be very different ways that local or First Nations doctors or healers would provide services from how Western doctors would. Can you speak a little bit more about that? Not necessarily just health, but some of the challenges in providing those services and listening?
We have quite a few, like within the region, we have our own Aboriginal medical health services. A lot of that comes down to language and understanding. Liza, you might be able to talk a little bit more about this. So our Nunkaris work in hospitals, they work in communities, but it's side by side. So they're not doing the job of what Western medicine does. They do their traditional healing side. So they work together. So it's not about ours is better, it's complementary.
Yeah, I think, the fact that we have Aboriginal community controlled health services speaks for itself. When we talk to new staff, why do we need these community controlled health services? What's wrong with the GP or the hospital? And it's that very reason. It's that understanding of, again, I'm going to say this, but worldviews and understanding around the way animals understand their health and well-being. And so that ability to have a localised health service that understands that and can work with that context, and particularly involving our traditional healers, who, as Lynette said, they're not alternative, they're complementary. And one of the greatest things that our Ngungkari team have done is actually really bridge that gap between Western medicine and traditional healers.
Thank you for explaining that. Now, at this point, with all of this detail that we have about NPY Women's Council and the work that you're doing, I'd like to shift to the topic of working with Jawun and how that connects to corporations such as BlueScope. So can you, Liza, continuing your talk there, give us a little bit more information about the NPY Women's Council connection to Jawun and how all this happens?
We joined Jawun back in 2014 after a very big gathering of Indigenous leaders from around the country who came together actually in the Central Coast of New South Wales to talk about a new way of working alongside government to change that balance between government control and community control. And that was the birth of Empowered Communities. But it was also then when we joined Jawun. I think our relationship with BlueScope goes back fairly close to the beginning. It wasn't our first secondees, but it was not far into it, maybe 1 or 2 years into our partnership with Jawun, we started to have BlueScope secondees, and we're very proud to say that BlueScope identified NPY as their preferred region, which we were really, really thrilled about, because I think we're going to hear a little bit more about the work of secondees, but we just can't say enough good things about the work that we've done with BlueScope and the amazing things that every single one of the secondees has achieved in such a short amount of time, which ultimately is really about 4.5 weeks. Even though it says 6 weeks, it's really about 4.5.
Well, you provided the perfect segue there to talking about our secondees. So thank you for waiting there patiently, Aneta and Yasmine. Let's turn to you now and talk about that experience of being on Jawun and working in these regions and with organisations such as NPY Women's Council. Aneta, maybe first to you, can you talk about what your experience was, what motivated you to embark on that journey with Jawun, and what brings you here today?
Absolutely. I've actually heard the Jawun alumni present a BlueScope, and I was, during those presentations, very inspired about the program. I wanted to learn more. I submitted my application to participate in the program, and at the time when I was accepted, COVID hit, and we've closed, obviously, the country borders and state borders, and the program was moved to virtual sort of secondment, which was very disappointing, because I really wanted to go to the region and experience all the amazing things that I've heard about. It was a bit of a roller coaster of emotions at the same time, because obviously I was given a project and I wanted to do my best to add value to the Women's Council. My project was actually to conduct an analysis and provide recommendations for possible future solutions for on-site document management applications. And it was really hard doing all of that remotely. And incredibly, actually, a month ago, I was given the opportunity to complete my Jawun experience in person and join the new cohort of Jawun secondees in person for the induction week. And that was the first time I had the opportunity to meet Liza and Lynette in person. We've had the onboarding week actually jam-packed with presentations, history lessons, discussions around challenges, but also opportunities in the region. And I was just blown away by how passionate people are. And I'm not just talking about the organizations that obviously do an amazing work in the region, but also people that participate in the Jawun program. And I've had the opportunity to learn, experience things that I haven't had the opportunity to learn, experience before. So it was absolutely incredible to be part of it, even just for a week. So I definitely encourage everyone at BlueScope to look into the program and see whether they have the opportunity to join.
Fantastic. Thank you, Aneta. And Yasmine, your experience? What brought you to Jawun and what were you doing there?
Yeah, so I guess I found out about Jawun fairly early on because I was working in the corporate head office and they were just discussing at that time this program and it was new for us and participating. So I sort of got wind of it quite early and then had the benefit, like Aneta, of seeing other people share their experiences. And, you know, for me, it just seemed like a really unique opportunity to actually get out into these remote areas, which you probably wouldn't, or certainly from my perspective, I wouldn't have otherwise gone to, and actually see the issues firsthand myself. And I think for me, that was probably, you know, the most memorable and also eye-opening part of the experience was actually going out into the communities, into some very remote areas, sort of at the intersection of Northern Territory, South Australia and Western Australia, very, very far from anything, and accompanying one of the child nutrition workers on her round. So I really got to live a few days in the life of one of these human service providers and see what it was like. And for me, it was really that brought home everything I'd read and heard Liza talking about in terms of how NPY Women's Council operates, how they provide services. It wasn't really until I saw it for myself that I kind of understood it and it all fell into place. And, you know, Liza made the point before, it's a very personal service and it's personal not only from the recipients of those services and how they feel comfortable interacting with the service providers, the degree of trust that's been established between the organisations from having such a long history of operating in the areas, and the degree of trust with the individuals and the way that they communicate and the way that they provide those services to that particular community with the level of understanding and integration and support is, I think, really unique and just such a fantastic service to have in those communities. And, you know, my mind always turns to, well, what would happen if they weren't there? And I think, you know, these organisations for me they're really crucial to try to maintain, you know, really kind of a minimum or basic standard of living in these remote communities and the importance of their longevity and being able to support those communities. It was, I think, something that I really took away and wanted to continue to help with. My project itself was to help the organisation find some avenues for funding. NPY Women's Council is predominantly funded by the government, as are many of the organisations in the area. But, you know, when I sort of arrived there, the central head office team is fairly under-resourced, you know, for want of a better term. I think if someone like BlueScope had to operate with the level of resourcing that Liza does, I think things would not function so well like we're used to. So it's really just so critical for the organisations to continue to have appropriate funding and resources and being able to attract those individuals that can provide these really important personal human services. So, you know, it's really, I guess my eyes were open to what happens in that region, a part of Australia I wouldn't have otherwise gone to. I was really actually happy that BlueScope had chosen that region because I think corporates in particular tend to support communities where they have, which are part of their operating footprint. And one of the big challenges for the APY lands and that community is no one really has an operating footprint in that area. So it's kind of almost a bit of a forgotten pocket in the centre where you do rely on organisations like BlueScope to go outside of their footprint and find the area that's most in need and try to support and add value and help in those communities. So for me, it was just a really fantastic opportunity. And I echo Aneta's words as well, for anyone that is looking to, make a difference and have that experience. I think the Jawun program is just a fantastic opportunity.
That's a great endorsement. Thanks for encouraging people there. And Yasmine and Aneta, and feel free to interject with each other here and share your experiences and have this conversation. But I'm interested particularly in each of your professional backgrounds. We have someone who works in marketing communication here. We have someone who's in legal. What were some things that you learnt, and how did you address or meet those challenges with the skills that you have with your respective disciplines? Maybe kicking off, Yasmine.
Yeah, look, I mean, legal's an interesting one, right? Because it doesn't necessarily directly fit into helping an organisation that provides human services. So I think in terms of the project that I did with, helping to prepare a kind of almost a prospectus style or investment style document to help attract investment predominantly from outside of the government. I think some of the skills I use are just, my background in commercial and corporate organisations, having prepared those type of documents to get funding for, various organisations, probably more before BlueScope, but also I guess my background appealing to businesses and how they think, and, thinking about BlueScope and the type of things it would invest in and what would attract it to those opportunities. So that's sort of some of the background and skills that I brought. But I probably, in terms of my kind of on the ground experience there, I certainly learnt a lot of new skills, or I guess, became aware of the other skills that you need to sort of successfully operate in those regions. And Lynette mentioned listening, and I think absolutely slowing down, listening and observing were sort of some of the key. I mean, it sounds easy to do, right? But it's in a fast-paced corporate environment, you can easily overlook those things. So, when I did have the opportunity to meet community members to help out with the nutrition worker, I think those skills and that very different approach, is something that I took away with me from the experience.
Very similar for me. I sort of mentioned at the start that it was a bit of a roller coaster of emotions for me. I was given a brief, had a great meeting with Liza. I was full of optimism, how much value I can add and what change I can bring to the organisation. And then I started doubting myself. And, I went through the classic sort of experience of, can I really have an impact on the organisation, on the challenge that's sort of ahead of me? I agree with Yasmine. There's definitely, the whole experience humbled me, sitting down, listening, taking it all in really to sort of understand what it is that we need to provide, what challenges we need to address, rather than jumping straight into solutions. I think that's the key thing in the region, not making any assumptions that what the answer is or what the solution should be. And I guess looking at my role at BlueScope being communications manager, I sort of reverted back to, I guess, more core skill sets around project management or campaign management. And that's how I approached my brief with the Women's Council, looking at naming conventions, follow structures, some of a duplication of documentation, security of the information that's contained on the server as well. And I have to say that I got as much out of it, or even more probably, learning about First Nations topics. And there was a lot of conversations we've had, not just, I guess, as part of the program, but during the induction week, talking about a genocide, stolen generation, trauma, some of the forced changes and the fusion of two worlds. Liza mentioned at the start of this panel discussion that a lot of people talk about walking in two worlds. And that really comes through loud and clear. So it was an incredible opportunity for me to immerse myself in some of the topics, really absorb them, and obviously try and do my best to add value. And Liza did mention back in May that there was another secondee that carried my project through sort of to another stage, which was absolutely fabulous to hear. There's definitely a lot that goes on. There's a lot that we reflected on as part of the program. Every single day, we'd actually get the group together for discussions and reflections, because you really need time to digest it, to reflect on it. And even kind of think about how you can apply it in our own lives, and coming back to BlueScope at the end of this experience, how I can carry that sort of journey didn't stop with me finishing the Jawun program, how I can continue on that journey beyond as well.
In returning to BlueScope, Aneta, a key theme or topic that's been through this discussion with each of you has been that idea of listening. Listening is obviously a big skill that you develop in doing things like this. Are there any ways that you've been thinking differently or behaving differently, or skills that you attained that you've brought back to your daily work at BlueScope?
Yeah, I think over the last 3 years, I had many opportunities, not only to share my experience, but really reflect on it. And just having that opportunity to go into the region back in May, it was just really important for me to continue sharing what I've learned. I've since come back and obviously had the opportunity to present to my team as well on the topics that are important to the region and the organisation. I guess I just encourage people to be informed, whether that's, history of the region and Indigenous people in Australia, all the Statement from the Heart, the upcoming referendum and the Voice. I think it's just important that we do our own research and inform ourselves and have opportunities to discuss those topics with friends and family.
Perfect. And you, Yasmine?
Similar, I guess. I mean, I think we reflected a lot at the end of the Jawun placement about how we do continue to contribute and what we can take away and use. And for me, I guess I went at quite an interesting time, sort of November, December last year, and shortly after leaving, there was a lot of media about, alcohol and violence and things getting a bit out of control in the Alice Springs area. And I think, similar to Aneta, it was really interesting to be, I suppose, more informed, but also to just have a different lens on it than what you might sort of read in the media. I think a greater degree of empathy and understanding that this is not just one issue happening on the ground right now. It's probably the culmination of generations worth of government policies and other cycles of trauma and experience that have led to this point. Certainly what I've tried to bring back are some of those skills, that I learned a bit more by having an opportunity to work in the human services area in terms of personal interactions and different approaches to resolving issues and to helping people as well. And also just to bring that greater level of understanding of what actually underlies some of these issues and questioning, I guess, a bit more what I might read or hear in the media and self-assessing whether that actually corresponds with what I saw on the ground, and trying to help to communicate with others some of the challenges faced by a region that, I've lived in Australia my whole life and I had no idea of the circumstances of the NPY lands and the very sort of basic level of things like accommodation and hygiene and services in those really remote communities, and trying to broaden the awareness of people of what that is like in our country.
Now, on that word awareness, turning back to you, Lynette and Liza, can you please tell us a little bit more about your experience and thoughts on that, the significance of what Jawun people or Secondis leave behind, and thinking about that awareness and regularly discussing and considering and celebrating First Nations cultures? Maybe, Lynette, to you first. Tell us about that impact and the importance of awareness.
I think it goes both ways, because the Jawun Secondis, they bring all of their experience and knowledge from their workplaces and their experience, and what they're bringing it does provide impact on the ground. Whilst you're probably not going to have members come and tell you that, but they're getting that. It's the knock-on effect that they're getting with the frontline service delivery. But around awareness, I think it's so important. Like Yasmine said, she's lived in Australia her whole life and she didn't know. So it is really important to be aware and just to open your mind, open your hearts. I think there's so much information out there around learning and being educated. But the legacy of the Jawun Secondis is really important. Liza's often spoken about the longevity. Like if you start a campaign, you start advocating for something, it takes 10 years for the actual for it to be to be realised and seen. So it is there, and any small contribution does make a really big difference. And I think you coming in, having those experiences and learning and seeing and listening is so important to the wider Australia. So I think it's a two-way street there.
And Liza, did you have anything to add to that, particularly that idea of spreading awareness?
Yeah, definitely. I think, as Lynette said, it's a two-way opportunity. The Biddenjarra phrase for that here is nabbaji nabbaji, which is you give me something and I give you something back. And it's very much about that. It's a partnership. And we were very strategic early on with our secondee program to ensure that we were making the best use of these incredibly knowledgeable and experienced people that we were getting to make sure that they were really contributing towards our strategic goals. And so it can sound really dry sometimes. And, I love listening to Aneta speak about her work on our document management and server. And I think that's got to be the most boring brief of all time. And yet she's so passionate about it. It does sometimes seem like it's really dry work and maybe not always everyone can see how that's contributing to the bigger picture, but it definitely is. And it's, it's contributing to our strategic goals of becoming financially sustainable, being an employer of choice, being evidence-based and working to best practice, all those things that might seem small or might seem, very administrative. But at the end of the day, this is what makes us, our organisation, capable and competent to deliver these really difficult and complex services that is ultimately trying to improve the lives of people who are probably the poorest people in the country. If secondees come here and they take away just a small part of that understanding, that helps to share that knowledge across the country. And it always astounds me how little people know about the life and circumstances of Aboriginal people in this country, and particularly in remote communities. But I've got this lovely story, and I'm not sure if he's online, but I don't want to embarrass him too much. But Andrew, who was a secondee, and his very first day here with us, we had an all-staff meeting. And this was long before Teams and Zoom and all of that. So we had the old video conferencing in the conference room, and all of our remote staff were online and the town-based staff were in the room. And we had this microphone that you had to use so that the people online could hear everybody in the room. And the microphone, our IT manager had rushed out and bought at the post office, which was a karaoke microphone. So it was glittery gold and it had shiny lights on it and it was really big. And I was up the front, welcoming people, and I was introducing Andrew, and I said, actually, Andrew, you can come up and introduce yourself and tell us what you're working on. So he came up with this karaoke glittery, massive microphone and had to speak in front of all these people. And in his last week here, we were having our kind of final meeting, and he told me that public speaking was his greatest fear of all time. And there it was. I put him up there with a disco microphone. So, it's those little things you don't expect that you're going to grow and develop. But it's, because we're not corporate. We're an NGO and we are under-resourced. And so you actually gain a whole lot of other skills, not just knowledge about Indigenous issues.
Thanks for sharing that anecdote. That's fantastic. And I want to pick up on a point you were talking about. We've been talking about awareness. We've been talking about education. Recently was NAIDOC Week, and that's a fantastic opportunity to celebrate different First Nations cultures and think about their role across Australia. But as is the challenge with just about any kind of week or day or celebration or awareness campaign, there's that challenge of thinking and talking about things beyond that date on the calendar. Picking up on that point that you mentioned, Lynette, before Liza was just speaking about education, what are some different resources or pieces of information or places that you believe are the best to go, whether people have a First Nations background or not, to learn more about First Nations experiences, how they can be celebrated across Australia and just enhance your understanding?
I think SPS is great. Like that's for NAIDOC, they had a huge catalogue of Indigenous-made films. Even that is really helpful. You've got the Australian Wars, which was recently, I think it was on ABC or SBS. So that was Rachel Perkins. There's so much out there. I think if people want information, it's there. Like, you just stick it in Google. IATSIS is a really good resource. It's to me, it's baffling if someone doesn't actually know anything about Indigenous Australians. To me, that just says you don't want to know. So there's so much information out there.
Thank you, Lynette, and others on the call here, Liza, Yasmine, Aneta. Are there any resources that you can recommend in addition to those broadcasters, or things that you've read or engaged with to enhance your own understanding?
I'm going to agree with Lynette. Stick it in Google. You'll see there's a number of websites that actually are quite comprehensive. Additionally to that, there's a number of events around the country. We recently had the Sydney Film Festival that had a number of films dedicated to Indigenous stories. I actually went to see The New Boy. The director, Warwick Thornton, is a Indigenous film director born and raised in Alice Springs. And it was just a magical movie telling you story of Indigenous people in Australia from a completely different perspective. So, plenty of opportunities to get engaged. And like Lynette said, if you just want to know, I think, almost every single week there's something happening across the country.
Thank you, Aneta. Liza, Yasmine, anything to add?
Not vastly. I mean, ABC, I think, is probably where I get most of my content and watch a lot of them. And they have lots of little snippets, insights, short documentaries, which are just fantastic. But I don't obviously have it to hand. But while I was actually on the Jawun secondment, our coordinator gave us a whole heap of really great links and resources to have a look at as we were sort of opening our minds and learning and hearing from NPY Women's Council and all the organisations. There was a bit of a reading list there that was actually really good as well. So I can try to find some of those and make them available after this.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say that we've also, our Ngungri team have got their Healing Hands book. It's Healing Hands, isn't it, Liza?
Yeah, it's just called Traditional Healers. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a great one to learn about traditional healers. There's so many Indigenous authors out there as well. So just Google. It sounds very simple, and it is simple, but you'll stumble across anything. There's so much.
Perfect. And we can collect things and share a list afterwards. And there are a lot of resources internal to BlueScope, but also out there, broadcasters through Google, different things that we can share. Now, I think it's probably time to move towards the Q&A segment, and I'll turn to Jess now. Jess, do we have any questions that have popped up or things that you can share and answer?
Yeah, so we've had quite a few questions around Jawun, which is exciting. Lots of interest in the program and how to get involved and find out more. But we do have a question for yourself, Lynette and Liza. As an NGO, this is from Kathy, by the way, as an NGO, you need to navigate multiple state, territory and federal bureaucracies. Is that getting any easier?
No, and again, we are probably the most complicated region in the country in terms of an organisation because we are tri-state, but also Commonwealth. And it's incredibly challenging to navigate all those 4 jurisdictions, not just around funding, but also around things that other people might not even be aware of. So like 3 different police jurisdictions, 3 different child protection jurisdictions, 4 different health services, so it is really challenging. But again, it's the determination of our members and directors to be an NPY region and not just a South Australia and not just a Northern Territory. And I think the rationale behind that is really sensible because it's a very small population. So when you bring the 3 language groups together, you actually create a critical mass. And that's what enables the women to stay strong and to have a voice and to speak up, to be brave enough to speak up.
Fantastic. Were there further questions, Jess?
There's another one that's popped up from Lucy. Is there an opportunity for me to make personal financial contributions to assist?
Of course, we would love that. We're always building we call them our ambassadors, really, people who support us like that. And you can either do that by contacting us directly or through our website. Although don't try to go to our website today; it has crashed. So maybe give it a couple of days.
Beautiful. So I have a question, and this is kind of open to all 4 of you. But what would you suggest for people? I know we've spoken about building our cultural awareness, but if someone's really looking to be a First Nations ally, what would your key insights and advice be?
And Lynette?
Again, it's education. It's finding. One of our managers sent around a 10-topic course. It's IATSIS. So they're based in Canberra, but they're just about to open a office and a facility and a resource in Alice in the next couple of months. But they store so much information of Aboriginal cultures and Torres Strait Islander cultures throughout the whole of Australia. So their course would be great. It's called CORE. You can just jump on. But just education. Just keep looking and being inquisitive and asking. And there's so much, like with Yasmine and Aneta, like just little small bites. Have conversations with people. The Yes 23 campaign, there's information on there.
I would encourage people also to do more than just sort of read the current news, which often focuses on sort of negative aspects of what's happening in those communities, and to look a bit deeper into, as Lynette said, some of the information or books or stories around the culture itself, because there's some really amazing things that I observed or that people showed me or told me while I was out there that really just cemented in my mind how incredible and long-lasting the history and the culture is. So I think look for those opportunities as well. And, Lynette mentioned it at the end, this year you get the opportunity to support First Nations people with an actual vote. So
beautiful. We've got time for one last question, and it's another one from Kathy. Lynette, for you, when it comes to walking in two worlds, what could BlueScope do as an employer to make it easier for its Indigenous employees?
I think a really good start is doing like cultural learning, and this core is for Australia wide, so it's not specific, and that's really generalised. And I think that's a really good way to start, is for people to start getting that awareness and just talk to your employees. People are really generous, like with their time, and I think even just having a space for people to sit down and have a yarn. Invite people.
Thank you for facilitating that, Jess, and keeping an eye on the chat and sharing those questions. Before we wrap up, I might just throw it out to each of you. Is there something that hasn't come up in the Q&A or through our earlier conversation for this session that you would like to highlight, or a thought that you would like to leave attendees today? Maybe looking to the future, or the path that we're on, maybe going alphabetically again, just to keep it easy. What's a final thought, or something perhaps we didn't ask you?
Look, there's just so much. It's really hard to pick one. Obviously, we've mentioned a few of the key topics coming up, the referendum, the voice, obviously history. I would encourage anyone who has the opportunity to visit the region to actually do so. It is completely different reading it online in the news and actually seeing it firsthand. But even meeting some of the Arunda traditional owners in the region, having guided walks, talking around the meaning and the significance of some of the sacred sites or century-old traditions. It just blows my mind how much there is. Like I said, every evening, and when we did the Jawun secondment, we would gather around the campfire and just reflect on things. We even ate kangaroo tails, which I've never done in my life. So just having those little experiences and sort of completing the knowledge that, some people already have, and seeking more constantly.
Yeah, again, look, there's so much we could talk for hours, but I think if we are reflecting on the theme of NAIDOC Week this year, it's celebrating our elders, and I can't stress enough about how important these people are. They are the keepers of the knowledge and of ancient knowledge, and we are losing that, sadly. There are some parts of Australia where people don't have their language anymore. We are really lucky in our region that everybody's their language is still very strong and maintained, and their cultural practices are still maintained. And I think developing your knowledge and understanding of just this culture and how wise they are and how they've managed to stay alive, I think, for thousands of years, and just reflecting on the referendum and the voice, this is not a new thing. This is not just something that's come up this year. This is hundreds of years of Indigenous people in this country fighting for what's rightfully theirs and their place in this country. And I think this is just a next step. And so if you want to understand what this is all about, what is the voice about, what is the referendum about, go back and learn history, go back and right from pre-colonial times and what the Aboriginal people in this country have had to go through, what changes they've seen, what battles they've won. And this is just the next one.
I wasn't going to mention this, but following on from what Liza's just said, a cousin of mine delivers cross-cultural training, and she puts up a map of Australia and puts all the nations, and then she puts where all the massacre sites were, and then she takes that away and shows where all the where the actual language speakers still are. And of course, all of the East Coast is kind of, there's not a lot of language speakers. And I thought it was really beautiful. She said, well, there's often not conflict, but there's always talk about, people in the centre and in the regional, they've got their culture, they've got their language, and people over here don't have it. And what she described, she said, well, they're our resistance fighters. So going on from what Liza said, we've all had different fights, and now with the referendum, it is our opportunity to actually contribute and have a say in our own lives. And it's really important because we've had policies passed that have all been well-meaning and but haven't worked. So I think, let us have a go. So that's what I'd like to leave it with.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I definitely echo the sentiments of Liza and Lynette as well. I mean, one of the key takeaways that I brought home with me after the Jawun experience was just sort of the enormity of the challenge. And I have great respect for Liza, Lynette, and all of the service providers in the area who have dedicated, in some cases, most of their lives to trying to improve conditions in that remote and difficult area. I just, I couldn't say enough how, overwhelmed I would be if I was facing that challenge day in, day out. So absolutely the longevity of the challenge and also getting your head around the fact that even though, as Liza said, we've been sort of, dealing with these issues in this transition since settlement, also accepting that we've got a very long way to go before we get to an end point that's sort of fair and equitable and serves everyone's purpose. And that might not happen in, my lifetime or our lifetimes, but I think it's important to recognise that no matter what stage you're coming into this conversation and, joining a call like this and trying to educate yourself and become more aware, there's always something or more that you can do. And, the more people that can be doing more, the more chance you have of getting to that end point eventually. So, I think, acknowledging that we're just a sort of a blip in the path, I'd like to think that it's going in a positive direction and to do what I can to help with that.
Before we go, Martin, I just wanted to leave it with a big thank you to BlueScope and to all of the secondees that have been partnered with us over the years, and we really look forward to continuing that relationship. I also wanted to just end to let you know that we have to run away now to attend a morning tea for one of our directors who received her Order of Australia medal last night. So we're very excited.
Wow. You should definitely get to that.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, well, thank you, everyone, and have a fantastic day. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you later.
All the best.
Bye.
We thank Aneta, Liza, Lynette, and Yasmine for generously giving their time to participate, Jessica for organising the panel discussion, and all people at BlueScope who attended the live stream on the day. We also thank you for engaging with this important discussion of NPY Women's Council and experiences with Jawun, and more broadly for joining us to celebrate the history, cultures and achievements of First Nations across Australia. If you'd like to learn more or get access to any of the websites or resources that were mentioned in the discussion, please visit the links and show notes in your browser or podcast app. Thank you for listening to the Voices of BlueScope podcast. We hope to have you again soon.